The autumn of 1841 brought an unusual chill to Whitmore Plantation in rural Georgia. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under a grey sky that seemed perpetually overcast, as if the very heavens had turned their back on this cursed piece of earth. Master Jeremiah Whitmore stood on his mansion's wraparound porch, surveying his domain with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he owned not just land and crops, but human souls. The plantation housed nearly 200 enslaved people, their quarters arranged in neat rows behind the main house like a small village of suffering. Among them lived Rebecca, a 22-year-old woman whose presence seemed to disturb the very air around her. She had arrived 3 months prior, purchased from a failing plantation in South Carolina, and from the moment she set foot on Whitmore soil, strange things began to happen. Rebecca was different from the other enslaved people. While they sang work songs and spirituals that everyone recognized, Rebecca's voice carried melodies that seemed to come from another world entirely. The words she sang were in no language anyone could identify. Not English, not the African tongues some of the older slaves still remembered, but something ancient and haunting that made listeners' skin crawl. Overseer Thomas Caldwell, a brutal man with scarred hands and a perpetual sneer, had taken an immediate dislike to Rebecca. He found her songs unsettling and her quiet demeanor defiant. "That woman's got the devil in her," he would mutter to anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, she's trouble." The other enslaved people were divided in their feelings about Rebecca. Some, like old Moses, who had lived on the plantation for 40 years, believed she possessed a gift, or perhaps a curse, that connected her to the spirits of those who had died on this land. Others, frightened by the inexplicable events that seemed to follow in her wake, kept their distance. On this particular evening, as the sun disappeared behind the tree line and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Rebecca stood at the edge of the cotton field. Her voice rose in one of her mysterious hymns, the melody weaving through the air like smoke. The sound carried across the plantation, reaching every ear, and those who heard it felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. Master Whitmore paused in his evening whiskey, the glass halfway to his lips. The song seemed to penetrate the walls of his mansion, seeping into his very bones. For a moment, he could have sworn he heard other voices joining Rebecca's, whispers and moans that spoke of pain and injustice, of lives cut short and graves unmarked. In the slave quarters, families huddled closer together as Rebecca's hymn continued. Children pressed against their mothers, sensing something in the air that their young minds couldn't comprehend, but their souls recognized as dangerous. The melody spoke of things buried but not forgotten, of debts unpaid and justice delayed. As Rebecca's voice finally faded into the night, a profound silence settled over the plantation. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, heavy with anticipation and dread. In that moment, everyone, master and slave alike, felt the presence of something watching from the shadows, something that had been awakened by the power of Rebecca's voice. The wind picked up, rustling through the cotton plants with a sound like whispered secrets. And in that wind, those with sensitive ears could still hear the echo of Rebecca's hymn, as if the very air had absorbed her words and would carry them forever across this haunted land. Thomas Caldwell had always prided himself on being a man who feared nothing. At 35, he had spent 15 years as an overseer, first in Mississippi and now in Georgia, and he had broken more spirits than he could count. His whip was his authority, his cruelty, his reputation. But Rebecca's songs were beginning to crack something deep inside his hardened exterior. It started with the dreams. Every night since Rebecca's arrival, Caldwell found himself plagued by visions of faces he recognized, enslaved people he had beaten, some who had died under his watch. In these dreams, they stood in endless rows, their eyes fixed on him with an accusation that made his soul writhe. And always, Threading through these nightmares came Rebecca's voice, singing those incomprehensible hymns that seemed to give the dead a voice. During the day, Caldwell tried to maintain his iron grip on the plantation's operations. He drove the workers harder than ever, as if brutality could somehow silence the growing unease that gnawed at him. But Rebecca remained untouchable in a way that infuriated him. When he raised his whip to her, something in her eyes stopped him. Not fear, but a knowing look that suggested she could see straight through to his blackened soul. "You think you're special, don't you?" Caldwell snarled at Rebecca one morning as she worked in the cotton field. "Think your heathen songs protect you?" Rebecca looked up from her work, her hands never pausing in their rhythm of picking cotton. "I don't think nothing, Master Caldwell," she replied quietly. "I just sing what needs to be sung." "And what needs to be sung?" he demanded, stepping closer. Rebecca's eyes met his, and for a moment, Caldwell felt as if he were looking into a deep well that reflected not his face, but his sins. "The songs of those who came before," she said simply. "They got things to say." That night, as Rebecca's voice once again rose from the slave quarters, Caldwell sat in his small cabin, a bottle of whiskey his only companion. The hymn seemed different this time, more urgent, more personal. As he listened, he began to make out what sounded like names woven into the melody, names he recognized with growing horror. Samuel, Martha, Little Joe. These were people who had died on the plantation over the years, some from disease, others from the brutal conditions, and a few from Caldwell's own excessive punishments. How could Rebecca know these names? She had only been here 3 months, and most of these people had died years ago. As the song continued, Caldwell felt the temperature in his cabin drop. His breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and the shadows in the corners seemed to deepen and move. The whiskey bottle slipped from his trembling hands, shattering on the wooden floor. In the broken glass, Caldwell saw reflections that shouldn't have been there. Faces of the dead, their mouths moving in silent accusation. The hymn grew louder, though Rebecca was hundreds of yards away, and now he could clearly hear other voices joining hers, the voices of the dead. Caldwell stumbled from his cabin, desperate to escape the supernatural chorus. But the song followed him, carried on a wind that seemed to blow from every direction at once. As he ran through the plantation grounds, he saw other figures moving in the darkness, translucent forms that walked among the living, their eyes fixed on him with unmistakable intent. By morning, Caldwell was found by the other overseers, huddled behind the cotton gin. His hair turned white and his eyes wide with terror. He spoke in broken whispers about voices in the wind and faces in the shadows, but no one believed him. They assumed he had simply drunk too much and suffered from delirium tremens, but Rebecca knew better. As she passed Caldwell on her way to the fields that morning, she hummed softly under her breath, just a few notes of her mysterious hymn. The overseer's reaction was immediate and violent. He screamed and fell to his knees, covering his ears as if her gentle humming was the sound of his own damnation. From that day forward, Thomas Caldwell was a changed man. His cruelty turned to paranoia, his authority to desperation. He began to see the dead everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, in the faces of the living. And always, threading through his waking nightmares, came the sound of Rebecca's voice, singing the songs that gave voice to the voiceless and power to the powerless. The other enslaved people began to notice the change in their tormentor. Some felt a grim satisfaction at seeing their oppressor reduced to a trembling wreck. Others worried about what Rebecca's power might ultimately cost them all, but none could deny that something fundamental had shifted on Whitmore Plantation, and that Rebecca's hymns were at the center of it all. Word of Caldwell's breakdown spread through the plantation like wildfire. Master Whitmore, initially dismissive of his overseer's claims about supernatural occurrences, began to take notice when other disturbing events started to unfold. Livestock were found dead in their pens with no apparent cause, their bodies unmarked, but their eyes wide with what looked like terror. Tools went missing, only to reappear in impossible places, buried in the ground or hanging from tree branches too high for any human to reach. The enslaved community was divided in their response to these phenomena. The older generation, led by Moses, began to speak in hushed tones about the power of ancestral spirits and the importance of honoring the dead. They had seen similar things before, they claimed, in the old country and on other plantations where the suffering had been too great to bear. The dead don't rest easy when they've been wronged, Moses explained to a gathering of worried families one evening. And this land got more than its share of wronged souls. Rebecca herself seemed unchanged by the chaos swirling around her. She continued her daily work with quiet efficiency, speaking little, but singing her haunting hymns whenever the spirit moved her. But those who watched her closely noticed that her songs had begun to change. The melodies were becoming more complex, incorporating new voices and harmonies that seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. Young Sarah, a girl of 16 who worked in the main house, had become fascinated by Rebecca, despite her fear. She would often linger near the windows when Rebecca sang, trying to understand the strange language and the power it seemed to hold. One evening, she worked up the courage to approach the mysterious woman. "Miss Rebecca," Sarah whispered as they walked back from the fields together. "What do them songs mean? Where do they come from?" Rebecca looked at the girl with eyes that seemed far older than her 22 years. "They come from the ones who walked this path before us, child. Every soul that suffered here, every life that was taken too soon, they all got something to say." "But how do you know their words?" Sarah pressed. "I don't know them," Rebecca replied softly. "I just listen. And when I listen real hard, I can hear them singing. All I do is sing along." That night, Sarah lay awake in her small bunk, thinking about Rebecca's words. As she listened to the wind rustling through the trees outside, she began to hear something that made her blood run cold. Beneath the natural sounds of the night there were voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all singing together in the same mysterious language that Rebecca used. Sarah wasn't the only one who had begun to hear the voices. Throughout the plantation, sensitive souls were picking up on the supernatural chorus that seemed to grow stronger each night. Children woke, crying from dreams they couldn't explain. Adults found themselves humming melodies they had never learned. And always, at the center of it all, was Rebecca's voice, conducting this otherworldly symphony. Master Whitmore, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated. His business associates had begun to comment on the strange atmosphere at his plantation. Visitors reported feeling unwelcome, as if the very air was hostile to their presence. Some claimed to have seen figures moving in the fields at night, figures that disappeared when approached, but left behind the lingering scent of grave earth. The master's wife, Eleanor, had taken to her bed with what she claimed were severe headaches, but the household staff whispered that she had been seen talking to empty rooms and setting places at the dinner table for guests who never arrived. The Whitmore children, too, had become strange and withdrawn, speaking of invisible playmates who told them stories about the old times when the plantation was different. Dr. Matthias Crane, the local physician and a man of science, was called to examine both Eleanor Whitmore and Thomas Caldwell. After spending several hours at the plantation, he emerged pale and shaken, muttering about atmospheric disturbances and collective hysteria. But those who knew him well noticed that he avoided looking directly at the slave quarters and that his hands trembled as he packed his medical bag. As autumn deepened into winter, the phenomena at Whitmore Plantation intensified. The temperature seemed to drop whenever Rebecca sang, and frost would appear on windows and grass even on relatively warm days. Animals refused to enter certain areas of the property, and even the plantation's hunting dogs would whine and cower when taken near the old burial ground where enslaved people had been interred over the decades. Rebecca's power was growing, But so was the danger. Master Whitmore had begun to speak of selling her, of ridding his property of what he now openly called the source of our troubles. But every time he made plans to contact slave traders, something would happen to delay him. Important documents would go missing, his horse would refuse to leave the stable, or he would fall ill with mysterious ailments that disappeared as soon as he abandoned his plans. The enslaved community watched these developments with a mixture of hope and terror. Some saw Rebecca as their salvation, a conduit for divine justice that would finally bring their oppressors to account. Others feared that her power would ultimately bring destruction down on all of them, innocent and guilty alike. But Rebecca herself seemed to be listening to voices that none of the others could hear, following a plan that existed beyond the understanding of the living. Her hymns continued to echo across the plantation each night, growing stronger and more complex, as if she were building toward something, a crescendo that would change everything forever. The first death came on a moonless night in December. Thomas Caldwell, the once feared overseer, was found at dawn in the cotton field, his body twisted in an unnatural position among the withered stalks. There were no signs of violence, no wounds or marks to indicate foul play, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes wide and staring at something only he could see. Dr. Crane was summoned once again, but his examination revealed nothing that could explain Caldwell's death. The man's heart had simply stopped, as if he had been literally frightened to death. What disturbed the doctor most, however, were the strange marks in the soil around the body, patterns that looked almost like footprints, but far too numerous and overlapping to have been made by any living person. Master Whitmore stood over Caldwell's corpse, his face grim with a mixture of grief and growing fear. The overseer had been brutal, yes, but he had also been effective at maintaining order. More importantly, his death seemed to confirm what Whitmore had been trying to deny, that something supernatural was indeed at work on his plantation. "It was that woman," he muttered to his remaining overseers, "that Rebecca. She's brought some kind of curse upon us." But when they went to find Rebecca, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, in the slave quarters, surrounded by witnesses who swore she had been there all night. She showed no surprise at the news of Caldwell's death, only a quiet sadness that seemed to encompass more than just the loss of one life. "Death comes to all men," she said simply when questioned. "Some just hear it calling sooner than others." The funeral for Thomas Caldwell was a somber affair, attended by the white families of the surrounding area and conducted by Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a stern Presbyterian minister who had served the local community for over 20 years. But even as the Reverend spoke of eternal rest and divine judgment, strange things began to happen. The wind picked up during the service, howling through the cemetery with an intensity that seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion. Flowers wilted on the grave before the dirt had even been thrown, and several mourners reported hearing what sounded like laughter carried on the wind, not joyful laughter, but the bitter mirth of those who had suffered and finally seen justice done. Reverend Blackwood himself was visibly shaken by the events at the funeral. As a man of God, he had always believed in the supernatural, but he had never experienced anything quite like this. The very air around Whitmore Plantation seemed charged with malevolent energy, and he found himself thinking of biblical passages about the sins of the fathers being visited upon their children. After the funeral, the Reverend made an unprecedented decision. He would visit the slave quarters and speak with Rebecca directly. He had heard the rumors about her strange songs and the supernatural events that seemed to follow in her wake, and he felt it was his Christian duty to investigate. Rebecca received the minister with quiet dignity, showing him the same respect she would any visitor, but without the subservience that was expected from someone in her position. When Reverend Blackwood asked about her songs, she answered honestly. "I sing what the spirits teach me, Reverend," she said. "They got stories to tell, and I'm just the voice they use to tell them." "And what stories are those?" the minister asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Stories of suffering," Rebecca replied. "Of lives cut short and justice denied. Of children torn from their mothers and men worked to death in these very fields. The dead don't forget, Reverend. They just wait." Reverend Blackwood felt a chill run down his spine as Rebecca spoke. There was something in her voice, not defiance exactly, but a certainty that was deeply unsettling. She spoke of the supernatural as if it were as natural as breathing, and her calm acceptance of forces beyond human understanding made him question everything he thought he knew about the spiritual world. That night, as the Reverend tried to sleep in the guest room of the Whitmore mansion, he was awakened by the sound of singing. Rebecca's voice drifted through the walls, carrying one of her mysterious hymns, but this time it was different. This time he could almost understand the words, as if the language was slowly becoming familiar to him. The song spoke of judgment and retribution, of scales being balanced and debts being paid. It told of a reckoning that had been long delayed, but was now at hand, and of those who had profited from suffering finally being called to account. As the hymn continued, Reverend Blackwood began to see images in his mind. Visions of the plantation's history, of the countless souls who had lived and died in bondage on this cursed land. He saw families torn apart at auction blocks, children sold away from their parents, men and women worked to death in the cotton fields. He saw the casual cruelty of overseers like Caldwell, the indifference of masters like Whitmore, and the systematic dehumanization that had turned human beings into property. And through it all, he heard the voices of the dead crying out for justice that had never come. When morning arrived, Reverend Blackwood was a changed man. He had seen the truth of what had happened on Whitmore Plantation, and he understood that Rebecca's power was not evil, but rather a manifestation of divine justice that had been too long delayed. The dead were not resting because they could not rest, not while their suffering went unacknowledged and their oppressors went unpunished. As he prepared to leave the plantation, the Reverend sought out Rebecca one final time. He found her in the cotton field, humming softly as she worked, and he approached her with a newfound respect. "What will happen now?" he asked quietly. Rebecca looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. "What should have happened long ago?" she replied. "The truth will be told, and the dead will have their say. Justice may be slow, Reverend, but it always comes in the end." Following Thomas Caldwell's mysterious death, Master Whitmore hired a new overseer, a man named Jacob Morrison, who came with recommendations from plantations across the South. Morrison was younger than Caldwell, perhaps 30 years old, with a reputation for efficiency rather than brutality. He had heard the rumors about supernatural occurrences at Whitmore Plantation, but he dismissed them as the superstitious nonsense of ignorant minds. Morrison's first encounter with Rebecca came during his initial inspection of the workforce. As he walked through the cotton fields, making notes about productivity and organization, he heard her singing one of her haunting hymns. The melody was unlike anything he had ever heard, ancient and mournful, yet somehow beautiful in its otherworldly sadness. "What is that woman singing?" he asked one of the field hands. "That's Rebecca, sir," the man replied nervously. She sings the old songs." Morrison approached Rebecca directly, his manner businesslike but not unkind. "What language is that you're singing in?" he asked. Rebecca paused in her work and looked up at him. "It's the language of the spirits, Master Morrison. They teach me the words." Unlike Caldwell, Morrison didn't immediately react with anger or fear. He was a practical man who believed in maintaining order through fair treatment rather than terror. But as the days passed, he began to notice the strange atmosphere that permeated the plantation. Workers would stop their tasks to listen when Rebecca sang, their faces taking on expressions of both sorrow and hope. The very air seemed to vibrate with an energy that Morrison couldn't quite identify. More disturbing were the reports from other staff members. The cook claimed that food spoiled faster than it should, and that she sometimes heard voices in the kitchen when no one else was present. The stable master reported that horses were becoming increasingly agitated, refusing to enter certain areas of the property. Even the house slaves spoke in whispers about strange dreams and unexplained sounds in the night. Master Whitmore, meanwhile, was struggling with his own demons. Since Caldwell's death, he had been plagued by insomnia and vivid nightmares that left him exhausted and on edge. In his dreams, he found himself walking through endless fields of cotton, pursued by figures he couldn't quite see, but whose presence filled him with dread. And always, threading through these nightmares, came the sound of Rebecca's voice, singing songs that seemed to judge his very soul. The master's wife, Eleanor, had become increasingly unstable. She spent her days in her room, claiming to receive visits from people who had died years ago. The servants reported that she would set extra places at the dinner table and carry on conversations with empty chairs. When questioned about her behavior, she would only say that they had told her important things about the plantation's history, things that her husband needed to know. Dr. Crane made several more visits to the plantation during this period, but his medical expertise seemed inadequate to address the supernatural phenomena that were becoming increasingly common. He prescribed laudanum for Eleanor's nerves and suggested that Master Whitmore consider taking a vacation away from the plantation, but both recommendations were ignored. The enslaved community, meanwhile, was experiencing its own transformation. Rebecca's presence had awakened something in many of them, a sense of connection to their ancestors and a growing awareness of their own spiritual power. Some began to report their own visions and dreams, while others claimed to hear voices speaking to them in languages they didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Old Moses had become something of a spiritual leader among the enslaved people, interpreting the supernatural events and helping others understand their significance. He spoke of African traditions that had been suppressed but not forgotten, of ancestral spirits who watched over their descendants and demanded justice for past wrongs. "The ancestors are stirring," he would tell anyone who would listen. "They've been sleeping under this cursed ground for too long, but now they're waking up. And when the ancestors wake up, the world got to change." Rebecca herself seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. Her songs were becoming more complex and powerful, incorporating harmonies that seemed to come from multiple voices, even when she sang alone. Those who listened carefully claimed they could hear entire choirs joining her, voices of the dead, adding their testimony to her supernatural symphony. The weather, too, seemed to be responding to the spiritual upheaval. December brought unseasonably cold temperatures and strange atmospheric phenomena. Fog that appeared without warning, winds that blew from impossible directions, and skies that remained overcast even on days when the sun should have been shining. Local farmers began to report crop failures and livestock deaths, and some started to whisper that Whitmore Plantation had become cursed ground. As Christmas approached, the tension on the plantation reached a breaking point. Master Whitmore had planned a traditional holiday celebration, complete with a feast for the white families of the area and small gifts for the enslaved workers. But the supernatural activity intensified as the date drew near, as if the spirits were preparing for some kind of final confrontation. Rebecca's songs took on a new urgency during this period. She would sing for hours at a time, her voice carrying across the plantation with an intensity that made everyone stop and listen. The melodies spoke of judgment and revelation, of secrets being exposed and truth being told. And those who heard her singing began to understand that something momentous was about to happen, something that would change the plantation forever. The stage was set for a reckoning that had been building for decades. The dead were gathering their strength, the living were choosing their sides, and Rebecca's voice was calling them all to witness the final act of a drama that had begun with the first enslaved person to die on Whitmore soil. Christmas Eve, 1841, arrived with an unnatural stillness that seemed to press down on Whitmore Plantation like a heavy blanket. The air was so cold that breath misted even indoors, and a thick fog had rolled in from the swamps, obscuring the landscape and muffling all sound, except for the distant, haunting melody of Rebecca's voice. Master Whitmore had insisted on proceeding with his planned Christmas celebration, despite the increasingly disturbing events on his property. Local plantation owners and their families had been invited for dinner, and he was determined to maintain the appearance of normalcy. But as the guests arrived, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The horses pulling the carriages were skittish and difficult to control, shying away from the plantation grounds as if they sensed danger. Several guests commented on the oppressive atmosphere and the strange fog that seemed to cling to the buildings. Most unsettling of all was the constant sound of singing that drifted from the slave quarters. Not the familiar spirituals that everyone expected, but Rebecca's otherworldly hymns that seemed to penetrate the very walls of the mansion. Eleanor Whitmore had insisted on joining the dinner party despite her husband's protests. She appeared at the table dressed in her finest gown, but her behavior was erratic and disturbing. She spoke to empty chairs as if they were occupied by invisible guests, and she repeatedly mentioned the children who had come to visit. Children who, she claimed, had died on the plantation years ago and had important messages to share. "They want everyone to know what happened to them," Eleanor announced to the horrified dinner guests. "They want their stories to be told." Dr. Crane, who was among the invited guests, tried to calm Eleanor with medical reassurances, but she brushed off his concerns with an eerie lucidity that was perhaps more disturbing than her apparent madness. "I'm not ill, Doctor," she said firmly. "I'm simply listening to voices that the rest of you refuse to hear. This plantation is built on suffering, and the dead won't rest until that suffering is acknowledged." As the evening progressed, the supernatural phenomena intensified. Candles flickered without any wind. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and the temperature continued to drop despite the roaring fires in every fireplace. Most disturbing of all, Rebecca's singing grew louder and more complex, as if she were being joined by an invisible choir of hundreds of voices. Reverend Blackwood, who had been invited to offer a Christmas blessing, found himself unable to speak the traditional words of celebration. Instead, he felt compelled to address the spiritual crisis that was clearly unfolding around them. "We are witnessing something beyond our understanding," he told the assembled guests. "But perhaps it is not beyond our comprehension. Perhaps we are being called to account for sins that have gone too long unacknowledged." Master Whitmore tried to silence the Reverend, but his protests were drowned out by a sudden intensification of Rebecca's song. The hymn seemed to fill the mansion, penetrating every room and every heart with its message of judgment and revelation. And as the song reached its crescendo, something extraordinary happened. The fog outside began to glow with an ethereal light, and figures started to appear in the mist, translucent forms that moved with purpose toward the mansion. The dinner guests pressed against the windows, watching in awe and terror as dozens, then hundreds of spirits materialized in the plantation grounds. These were the souls of all those who had died on Whitmore Plantation over the decades. Enslaved people who had been worked to death, children who had died of disease and neglect, men and women who had been beaten or tortured by cruel overseers. They came in a silent procession, their faces bearing witness to the suffering they had endured in life. Rebecca's voice rose above the supernatural gathering, her hymn now clearly audible to everyone in the mansion. And for the first time, the guests could understand her words, not because she was singing in English, but because the spirits themselves were translating her message directly into their hearts and minds. She sang of lives cut short and families destroyed, of children sold away from their mothers and fathers worked to death in the cotton fields. She sang of the casual cruelty of masters and overseers, of the systematic dehumanization that had reduced human beings to property, and she sang of justice delayed but not denied, of a reckoning that had finally come. As Rebecca's hymn continued, the spirits began to move through the mansion itself, passing through walls and doors as if they were made of mist. They gathered around the dinner table, their presence so overwhelming that several guests fainted from the sheer spiritual pressure. Master Whitmore himself was frozen in his chair, staring at the ghostly figures with a recognition that filled him with horror. Among the spirits, he saw faces he remembered, enslaved people who had died under his ownership, some from disease, others from the brutal conditions he had allowed to persist. He saw Samuel, who had died after being whipped for trying to visit his sick wife on a neighboring plantation. He saw Martha, who had died in childbirth because medical care was denied to enslaved women. He saw little Joe, a child who had died of pneumonia because he was forced to work in the fields during a winter storm. The spirits didn't speak, but their presence was accusation enough. They had come to bear witness, to ensure that their suffering was finally acknowledged and their stories finally told. And at the center of it all was Rebecca, her voice serving as a conduit between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. As the night wore on, the supernatural visitation continued. The spirits moved through the plantation, visiting every building and every corner of the property where suffering had occurred. They stood in the fields where they had labored, in the quarters where they had lived, and in the unmarked graves where they had been buried. Their presence transformed the plantation into a vast memorial to injustice, a testament to the human cost of slavery. By dawn, the spirits had begun to fade, but their message had been delivered. The truth about Whitmore Plantation had been revealed, and those who witnessed the supernatural visitation would never be the same. The dead had spoken, and their voices would echo through the generations, ensuring that their suffering would never be forgotten. The Christmas Eve visitation marked the beginning of the end for Whitmore Plantation as it had existed for decades. Word of the supernatural events spread quickly throughout Georgia and beyond, carried by the terrified guests who had witnessed the gathering of spirits. Some dismissed the accounts as mass hysteria or elaborate hoax, but others recognized them as something far more significant, a divine judgment on the institution of slavery itself. Master Jeremiah Whitmore never recovered from that night. The sight of the spirits, particularly those he recognized as people who had died under his ownership, shattered something fundamental in his psyche. He became a broken man, haunted by guilt and unable to function as the master of his plantation. Within weeks, he had taken to his bed, claiming illness, but really suffering from a spiritual wound that no doctor could heal. Eleanor Whitmore, paradoxically, seemed to improve after the visitation. The spirits that had been speaking to her for months finally departed, their message delivered and their purpose fulfilled. She emerged from her room with a clarity of mind that surprised everyone, but also with a determination that would change the course of her family's history. "We cannot continue as we have," she announced to her husband. "The dead have spoken, and we must listen." Eleanor began making arrangements to free the enslaved people on the plantation, despite her husband's weak protests and the outrage of their neighbors. She liquidated assets, sold land, and used the proceeds to provide each freed person with enough money to start a new life. It was an unprecedented act of restitution that scandalized the local community, but brought a measure of peace to the troubled plantation. Rebecca herself seemed unchanged by the dramatic events she had orchestrated. She accepted her freedom with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout her time in bondage, but she chose to remain on the plantation for several more months. Her songs continued, but they had taken on a different quality, less urgent, more peaceful, as if the spirits she channeled had finally found rest. Many of the other freed slaves chose to leave Georgia entirely, heading north to states where they might find greater safety and opportunity. But some remained in the area, drawn by the sense that something sacred had happened at Whitmore Plantation, that the land itself had been transformed by the supernatural visitation. Old Moses was among those who stayed. He established a small community on a portion of the plantation land that Eleanor had deeded to the freed slaves, and he began the work of preserving the stories that Rebecca's songs had revealed. He understood that the spirits had not appeared merely to seek revenge, but to ensure that their experiences would be remembered and their suffering acknowledged. "The dead don't want us to forget," Moses would tell anyone who would listen. "They want their stories to live on, so that what happened to them don't happen to others." Rebecca eventually left the plantation, but not before teaching her songs to others who had the gift to hear the spirits. She traveled throughout the South, appearing at plantations where supernatural phenomena had been reported, always singing her haunting hymns and always serving as a voice for the voiceless dead. Some said she never aged, that she was sustained by the spiritual power that flowed through her. Others claimed that she was herself a spirit, a manifestation of all the enslaved women who had died without their stories being told. But those who knew her best understood that she was simply a human being who had been chosen to serve as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The plantation itself became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the spiritual dimensions of slavery and its aftermath. Visitors reported hearing voices in the wind, seeing figures in the fields, and feeling the presence of the countless souls who had lived and died on that cursed ground. The main house fell into disrepair, but the slave quarters were maintained as a memorial to those who had suffered there. Reverend Blackwood, profoundly changed by his experience at the plantation, began preaching sermons about the spiritual consequences of slavery. He spoke of the need for repentance and restitution, of the importance of acknowledging historical wrongs and working to heal the wounds they had created. His message was not popular among his white congregation, but it resonated with others who had witnessed or heard about the supernatural events at Whitmore Plantation. Dr. Crane, meanwhile, abandoned his medical practice and devoted himself to documenting the supernatural phenomena he had witnessed. He wrote extensively about the connection between trauma and spiritual manifestation, arguing that places of great suffering could become conduits for otherworldly communication. His work was dismissed by the medical establishment of his time, but it would later be recognized as pioneering research into the psychological and spiritual effects of historical trauma. As the years passed, the story of Rebecca and her cursed hymns became legend. Some versions portrayed her as a vengeful witch who had called up demons to torment her oppressors. Others depicted her as a saint who had given voice to the suffering of her people. But those who had actually known her understood that she was neither demon nor saint, but simply a woman who had been chosen to serve as a conduit for voices that demanded to be heard. The songs themselves lived on, passed down through generations of African Americans who understood their power and their purpose. They were sung in churches and at gatherings, adapted and evolved, but always maintaining their essential message, that the dead do not forget, that suffering demands acknowledgement, and that justice, though delayed, will ultimately prevail. Today, visitors to the site of the former Whitmore plantation still report hearing voices in the wind, especially on cold winter nights when the fog rolls in from the swamps. Local historians have documented the supernatural phenomena, and paranormal investigators regularly visit the site, hoping to capture evidence of the spirits that Rebecca's songs awakened. But perhaps the most important legacy of Rebecca's hymns is not the supernatural phenomena they produced, but the historical truth they revealed. The spirits that appeared on that Christmas Eve in 1841 bore witness to the reality of slavery in a way that no written record could match. They transformed abstract historical knowledge into visceral emotional truth, ensuring that the suffering of the enslaved would never be forgotten or minimized. Rebecca's voice may have faded into legend, but the voices she channeled continue to speak to those who have ears to hear them. They remind us that history is not just a collection of facts and dates, but a tapestry of human experiences that includes both triumph and tragedy, both oppression and resistance. And they challenge us to listen not just to the voices of the powerful, but to the whispers of the powerless. The voices that speak from the margins of history, demanding that their stories be told and their suffering be acknowledged. In the end, Rebecca's cursed hymns were not really cursed at all. They were blessed. Blessed with the power to give voice to the voiceless, to bring justice to the oppressed, and to ensure that the dead would not be forgotten. They were songs of sorrow and songs of hope, songs of judgment and songs of redemption, and they continue to echo across the American landscape, reminding us that the past is never really past, and that the voices of the dead still have important things to say to the living.